Hello, everybody. Welcome to Kubernetes Cluster API Azure weekly office hours meeting. We are a project of SIG Cluster Lifecycle, and as such, we comply with their guidelines, mostly in terms of conduct, which boils down to everybody be nice to each other. Let's try to use the raise hand feature in Zoom so we don't accidentally talk over each other, and make sure everybody's had a chance to weigh in who's interested in a certain topic. First thing we usually do is provide a minute or two for people who are here for the first time to identify themselves if they want to and say hi and what they're interested in and what they do with CAPC or what they want to do with CAPC. So I will just back off for a minute or two, and if people want to unmute and say hello, that'd be great.
I can go real quick. My name is Chris Peterspan. I'm a Microsoft person. Work with a couple customers that are using the product, so I know some of the folks on the call, but mostly here just to listen in. So appreciate the time.
Awesome. Welcome, Chris.
Hey folks, here is Saverio. I'm also from Microsoft. I was here also the last time. I'm also helping a customer that is using the product, and I'm trying to get them a couple of PRs and closing a few issues that are important to my customer. I plan to stick around for a few weeks, maybe a few months, at least until I'm active with the customer and the product.
That's great. I can't tell you how exciting that is to hear you say customer over and over. Welcome. Anybody else want to say hello? All right, well, let's get moving then. Oh, I haven't been sharing my screen. Let me do that. There. Yeah, and if you want to add your name to the attendees list here, as you can see, people are doing. It's just nice to have a record, and then if people want to network later, or that's very helpful. I think we can skip milestone review for right now because it kind of folds into CAPC release status. I just put that on here, but honestly, I haven't been that plugged in, and Jack's been kind of hurting it more than I have. So do you want to?
Yeah, I would be delighted. Let's start with, let me add this as an agenda item just because I have the record. So I'm gonna walk us through some test grid status. So Matt, let's see, where do we want you to land? How about here? I'll paste this into, oh, you're there already. All right, cool. So yeah, beautiful. So before we release, we want to make sure that all of our covered release branches and main are green. And I've just given a cursory overview, and things look good, but I can walk through because there is some red. But I'd like to take a quick step back and talk about some changes to test grids. We recently sort of reclassified things. There was, actually, I'm not going to go into what used to be. I'll just describe what we have now, because I expect we'll have this for the long term. If we look at CAPZ, it should be CAPZ periodic -E2E main. So you got to go down a little bit because it's alphabetized there. Exactly right. So this is going to be our new sort of suite of test scenarios that run various what we'll call self-managed configurations. And there is a red failure for the cluster class test there. Both of those failures have to do with known issues with cluster cleanup. So we have something we're tracking where it seems that when we run a bunch of these scenarios in a single test run, which we are, that we have some issues cleaning up tests. And we were formerly seeing this signal with AKS, and now we're seeing it with cluster class. I'm not exactly sure what's going on. So that needs to be triaged, but the actual scenarios, I looked through them, are looking good. So that's a good signal that 1.6 is ready to go against main, which is where we conventionally cut our releases from. Matt, if you can go back, show you the other.
I wish I could. The Zoom widgets are preventing me from getting the button, and shortcuts are not working.
All right, I'll just give you
I'll just
another
open it
link.
again. I'll just do it again.
Here's a link. This is a fun dance.
It kind of is.
This is like
there we go. Sorry, you want to look at
cognitive test. So let's look at the AKS main test. So capc-periodic -e-to-e -AKS main. So this is also testing main, but it's a discrete sort of classification so that we can test AKS scenarios. So right now we only have one test scenario for AKS. You can see there's a bunch of tests that were running 1 hour apart there in the past as Matt's scrolling. So we've spent the last several days, maybe even a week, gathering a bunch of test data to validate that this is clean. So it's mostly green with some prow errors there. The last 2 runs are runs that follow along a configuration change to the test definition. So they now run twice daily. I think that's right. And so those are green. So the AKS scenario looks good at mains. That's great. So 1.6 looks ready to go. And then we also have, if you click on the tab, Matt, for V1 beta 1 and V1 beta -1. So we've got comparable test coverage for the N-1 and N-2. So right now, because the N is 1.5, -1 is N. Actually, it's really N and N-1. So we're currently testing 1.5 and 1.4. We will cut a new release of 1.4 and 1.5, like a final patch release of 1.4, and then rev to 1.6, after which point those V1 beta 1 and -1 tests will test the release branches for 1.6 and 1.5 going forward. I know that's a mouthful. Does anyone have any questions about any of this? Just pause. Cool. I think I can see you raise hand features, and I didn't see anybody. So, so yeah, the long story short is that testing is looking good. Hit us up on Slack if test grid is confusing to anyone, or if it's not clear why we would call this good. I know that there's an obvious red color there, has to do with a known issue with cleanup. So happy to talk more about that on Slack without going into too much detail here. So what that means is that 1.6 has, at least in this engineer's view, sufficient positive test signal to move forward. So we'll plan to cut a 1.6 release later on this morning. Matt, should we go to the milestone page and just make sure that the milestone is at this point empty of open?
Let's do, yeah.
Beautiful.
I think it's not literally empty, but
yeah, so we can move. So these are not going to land.
Yep.
So we'll move that to vNext. And you both of them. Awesome. Beautiful. All right. So next week we will go through the exercise of creating a 1.7 milestone. Let's wait. Let's not jinx ourselves by doing it before we cut 1.6.
Yeah, and we'll close this milestone as part of the release process. I think it's one of the docs.
And maybe if you want, let's click through to 1.6 and look at the closed issues. So if anyone wants to raise their hand and confirm that what they're expecting to be in 1.6 is there, feel free to do that, or scan over this. Hopefully, even watching the GitHub magic that Matt's been demonstrating, you can obviously do this for yourself. But if now's the time to raise concern if you think that what one of the changes or fixes you expect in 1.6 isn't going to land.
Keep doing the slow scroll for a minute here.
Yeah, it's
Oh,
I mean,
wow,
it's
we
a
got
bit
3
hard. Isn't it?
pages. Well, I'm not sure I want to roll through 3 pages. Sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Okay.
Yes, Saverio, go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead, please.
Sorry, I was raising the hand because I forgot to click it. No, I just wanted to ask a naive question. Now there is this release of 1.6 coming up. This project has like a regular release cadence, or so like because I'm new to the project, should I expect like a release after a certain amount of weeks, or you folks just release when there is a significant amount of work merged that you want to deliver in the next release?
Great question. Are you looking for the? Yeah, I was
Yeah,
doing
I
the
am.
same
I'm
thing.
trying to find the
So
doc that will.
it's actually documented, but the summary is that we release them. We cut a new minor release every month by convention, and you've been demonstrating some of the criteria that we use to determine a kind of go no go. I mean, the most important criteria, frankly, is the test signal. So if there were some extraordinary reason not to release, then we would prioritize that over keeping to a strict monthly release. But so far, we've been doing that for a few releases now, and it's been working out fine. So, and then we cut patch releases as needed, sort of according to a weekly consensus. So every week, we just sort of poll the room to see if there are changes, fixes that have been cherry picked back to the currently supported release branches that are needed. And then if we get some desire for that, then we'll cut a patch release.
Okay, then I'll be a little bit more specific with my question. I don't have any concern for this release 1.6, but if I would like something to be included in 1.7, then I should expect the PRs to be merged in about a month time. And would this be the right meeting, like to get those PRs labeled with the milestone?
Yeah, right. Since we're running on a monthly cycle, it's not strict, but I would say we probably follow a kind of common, say 75% of the release cycle is development and the last 25% is integration and testing and validation. So if you want something in 1.7, please, to the extent that you are able to prioritize getting that introduced the beginning of the development cycle, you'll have a better chance of that landing.
Okay. Yeah, I have already PRs in flight, so I'll just comment on those that I would like the milestone tag, and then someone will, with the right access, will be able to pick that up and add the label, right?
That sounds exactly right. Yep.
Thank you.
Also, at most of these meetings, we try to fly over what's in the next planned release, and that's a good time to just basically say this should be in there, and usually there's not much resistance to adding it to the milestone.
Yeah, I would vote to punt on that for next week, just so we can focus on 1.6. But if you're able to come next week, and you should have a real-time opportunity to voice your advocacy for prioritization and make sure it's in the milestone and all that kind of thing.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Great. Cool. Any other questions, concerns?
So as far as release status, we have clean enough signal from test grid, and I don't think we're waiting for anything else to merge. So we're just going to go ahead today. Is that the plan?
I think that's the plan. Yeah.
Are you going to try and crowdsource it, or invite people to play along if time permits?
If folks would like, I'd be happy to drop in a Zoom link and go through it myself. Go through it in, a communal way. Does anybody want to watch somebody release CapZ from his basement in Portland, Oregon?
I would.
All right. Yep, I'll
Awesome.
paste the link to Slack in the next hour or so.
Cool. Release. Let me just make some quick notes. Releases go today. Check. All right, if there's no further questions about the release plans, let's move on. Jack, you have the next thing about Azure Managed Clusters.
Yeah, we talked about this last week. So if you can click through that, so just a reminder that this is a thing we're actively working. I've been spending more of my focus in the last week in CAPI trying to clarify how we might drive to a long-term consensus. So I wanted to bring that to this group in terms of so we've had some prior conversations around how we might break the current V1 Beta 1 API and how that might affect users. We talked about the key reason to do that would be to achieve consistency across providers. So in recent weeks, really this is a sort of KubeCon outcome, which is great. This is the best part about going to KubeCon. Talked with a bunch of folks, and it seems like other providers are not going to necessarily be able to all agree in the near term on a particular, so if taking a little bit of a step back, a proposal landed in Cluster API a couple months ago that defined a couple of acceptable approaches to doing managed cluster Kubernetes in CAPI from a provider perspective, based on the fact that CAPI itself does not define a managed cluster specification. So it's really, at this point in time, it's up to the providers to figure out how to use the existing set of cluster API primitives and behavior expectations of those primitives, and then compose those into a managed cluster solution. So there have been a couple of different approaches. So that cluster API proposal was meant to sort of codify what those approaches look like. And after some consensus gaining, defining some like opinions about like this approach is acceptable, this approach has downsides, don't do this. This other approach is also acceptable for different reasons. So there was some understanding, like say a month ago, previous to KubeCon, that Kappa and CAPZ in particular would land on a common near-term proposal, which would include breaking changes. It appears that that's less likely, which means near-term consistency is not likely for managed cluster across the main, existing providers, Kappa, CAPZ, CapOCI, CapG. So really for our community, what this means is that the more likely sort of real world scenario that's going to bring consistency is going to be a long-term scenario. So I can't predict exactly what that means, but say anywhere between 6 and 18 months. So the idea would be that we will work with the CAPI community to actually, once and for all define what managed cluster looks like in Cluster API. And then that would require all the providers in the ecosystem at some point, let's say V1, to update their managed cluster implementations to fulfill this new Cluster API specification, which is going to be breaking across all providers. And again, the justification for that API breakage is the eventual goal of consistency across providers. So, short summary, getting providers to agree on a sort of consistent Frankenstein approach is hard. And we are leaning towards changing tack a little bit and baking this into Cluster API itself, which will sort of enforce provider consistency, just like for self-managed, the Cluster API spec is sort of paramount, like that is driving the entire story. And so the provider implementations follow from that. And so from a self-managed cluster perspective, CAPZ and Kappa and CapG are going to have a lot of consistency, because you're going to see the usage of, say, the AWS managed control plane and AWS cluster and Azure managed control plane and Azure cluster. It's going to sort of architecturally make sense across providers, because the the source of architectural authority is in CAPI, which is the sort of more foundational abstraction layer. I'll pause right now if anybody has any questions about that. Okay, cool. So really, this is the time that I would love to poll the community. Not this isn't the exclusive time, but I'll be continue to do this on Slack and in other media. But since we're all here, now would be a time to voice concerns about the sort of high level outcome of breaking the managed cluster API in, say, late 2023 versus late 2022. That to a certain extent is going to be more painful because we expect adoption and platform inertia to make any sort of transition more painful later on in time versus now. So the reason that we want to do that is really practical. It's like I said, the likelihood for consistency in the near term is low, and the benefit to the type of consistency we get by bringing this into KPI is much, much higher. So higher value, also higher cost. Any concerns or thoughts about any of this? Go ahead, Dane.
Let's see. Do you have a sense of what kinds of breaking changes, or have any specific breaking changes been identified yet?
I will paste a link to an issue that I encourage folks to read. This is not baked by any means, so it's just a conversation at this point, but I think I can confidently predict that the key bits of friction are the managed cluster. Sorry, this is recorded, so that I said that in recording. The cluster and the control plane CRDs as defined by Cluster API. So Cluster API defines a control plane CRD that has certain behavioral expectations with respect to like the API server endpoint. It also defines a cluster CRD, which has certain behavioral expectations for carrying cluster configuration that isn't specifically related to the control plane, like network CIDRs, things like that. So that makes sense as a way of decomposing the set of sort of Kubernetes cluster configuration surface area for clusters where everything is under the enforcement of Cluster API. In the managed cluster scenario, did that make sense, Dane, what I just said? Those two CRDs? In the managed cluster scenario, it makes less sense. So for AKS, for EKS, for GKE, there isn't a sort of well-defined, especially across the various managed service providers, well-defined understanding of what a cluster versus a control plane might mean. Like those are not really relevant architectural distinctions in the managed cluster scenario. And one of the outcomes that you would have been able to predict, and in fact it's true, one of the outcomes of having that that sort of architectural non-affinity is that each provider, Azure, AWS, GKE, Oracle, has sort of themselves decomposed the sort of single monolithic managed Kubernetes API representation that they, so EKS defines a cluster, AKS defines a cluster, and then in order to make it fit with the Cluster API set of architectural primitives, you kind of like say, all right, we're going to put these set of cluster configurations in this CRD, and then these other ones are going to go in this other CRD. So different providers have done a different way of doing that, which is sort of speaking to the consistency or the lack of consistency that we see across providers. If you want to use multi-cloud managed Kubernetes in Cluster API right now, you don't get the consistency sugar that you get with self-managed, which is one of the value propositions of Cluster API from the very beginning. Like, let's define what a cluster looks like once, so that you can run multi-cloud in if the context switch between various like cloud-specific stuff for every single environment that you're supporting, you can adhere to a common pattern. So the key thing, to answer your original question, is that particular decomposition of cluster and control plane. we expect that to change. We expect that when we bring this into CAP, if you read that issue, there's definitely debate. So it's not clear exactly how that's going to happen, but that's the key point, is advocacy towards a single common CRD source of truth in cluster API that defines managed cluster. That doesn't exist right now. So, concretely, that would mean all your, in any case where we're going to do breaking changes, what it really means is that your cluster templates for V1 beta 1 say aren't going to work with V1. And that's very hypothetical. I'm not predicting that this would land in a V1 specifically, but does that kind of give you some hints?
It does, yeah. I'm just coming from a position where we have quite a few, so I'm just trying to kind of think through what our migration story would look like from one to the next.
Yeah, I think it would be a part of this effort to I would advocate that a migration like a sort of formal official migration solution would be a requirement for any provider implementing this who has an existing managed cluster. So, if you want to implement this new CAPI thing that we've defined, and you've got an existing user community, then, this is how you provide migration, like automated migration for your users. That will be a part of that effort, because it's going to be, as we've said in previous meetings, to a certain extent, the clusters are going to be fine, because the underlying calls to the provider APIs should be consistent across. Just that the front door is going to be totally different. So we want to provide a way of doing some data transformations of the existing CRDs so that they now fit the new V1 beta 1, and maybe provide some tools for helping folks in their various tooling that they have to produce those templates, because they're going to look different now. Cool. So the one thing I wanted to go ahead, please.
Sorry, did I understand
go ahead.
correct? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
No, I just wanted to ask, did I understand correctly that the long-term goal is to have a CRD for managed clusters, and the goal is to use the CRD to describe AKS, GKE, EKS, like any possible managed cluster? Because I mean, I see a big challenge with that in the CRD, you should be able to represent in the API also things that are very specific of an implementation, and not necessarily like Kubernetes things. I make an example. I know that GKE and AKS, you can specify when you create a cluster, the maintenance window of when the cloud platform can perform an upgrade. So that's like super specific, and it's very different in each implementation. So I just wanted to add that my idea here, that maybe it makes more sense to create a CRD for each cloud provider that offers a Kubernetes managed implementation, rather than trying to merge everything in a single CRD that could easily like explode with a lot of options. I don't know if it makes sense, but from my experience in using managed Kubernetes, I see very hard going for a single CRD that can describe everything across multiple platforms. I just wanted to share this input. Thank you.
Yep, sure. Let me clarify a little bit of that. So all that is totally sensible. In fact, this is just how Cluster API works. So the idea is that the common thing that I'm referring to that would be defined in Cluster API is more abstract. And the providers bring all that specificity that is provider specific. This is the case with self-managed Cluster API right now as well. So CapZ has a bunch of Azure specific stuff. CapG has a bunch of specific Google stuff. Ditto for Kappa in AWS. It sort of like basic architectural separation concerns going on here. So Cluster API defines things at an abstract level, and then CapZ and CapG and Kappa define things at a more concrete level. But the point is that journey from abstract to concrete doesn't exist. It was not designed with managed cluster in mind. And so the way that we've implemented, the way that Kappa and CapZ and CapG have implemented managed cluster on top of the CAPI sort of abstract primitives just is hard to make consistent across providers and doesn't really make a lot of semantic sense. But your concerns are totally valid. That will not be the outcome. Mike, you raised your hand earlier.
Yeah, I think you answered most of what I was going to say.
Okay, cool. I should have led with this information. All that backstory I described about KubeCon and near-term turning into long-term and going into CAPI instead of following the sort of Frankenstein proposal recommendations, that this is actually not going to block, at least I'm advocating that this doesn't block the graduation from experimental of CapZ Azure Managed Cluster. It simply means that if we were to go this route, and if the CapZ community agreed, the breakage, we would not, so there's been an assumption that we prefer to introduce breakage while Azure Managed Cluster is classified as an experimental API. I'm advocating, or at least, with the CAPI group, I think the direction now is that the breakage is going to come from, say, V1 beta 1 to V1. So we would feel free to graduate CapZ from experimental to a stable API in V1 beta 1, independent from the consistency outcome. So that's I'll try to clarify that in this document. I'm waiting for a little bit more progress from the cluster API folks to assess the viability of that long-term proposal. But this doesn't mean that we won't graduate Azure Managed Cluster from experimental until 2 years from now or something. So hopefully that didn't scare folks. That's not clear. Go ahead, Mike.
I would actually say if, we're really talking that it's going to be 18 months or so before we have a consensus in CAPI and an implementation in CAPI, we may want to go a V1 sort of approach, just kind of following the same thing within upstream Kates, that things only stay in beta for so long once they're considered, if it's not experimental, it's only in beta for so long before it's graduated to that kind of V1 state. We may want to consider that kind of approach and look at a V2 sort of thing for the massive refactor, just because it is such a significant change from a V1 beta 1 to a V1. If we were to wait for that it really is almost a V2 beta 1 for that kind of shift.
Yeah, I think all these things are completely open to, and I think each provider will be able to make their own determination, assuming that this goes forward. And so, yeah, we'll definitely lean on the community to define how we want to do that.
Yeah, just my own 2 cents on it.
Mike, do you have any concerns about that breakage 18 months from now or 2 years from now compared to a near-term breakage? Do you have
I mean, if it's going to be, something that's so far in the future, going from a V1 to a V2, I mean, that happens, especially in the Kubernetes world. I mean, those things, happen. I would rather, personally, I think going from a, trying to hit a V1 from a V1 beta 1 for that kind of long term is better, because the more people that adopt a V1 beta 1, assuming it's going to be, people are just going to assume the V1 beta 1 is V1, the longer that it stays in that state, just because or at least that's been the experience that I've seen. I mean, look at what happened with Ingress. And I would hesitate to end up having the same thing happen to us with that assumption with the Azure Managed Clusters, that people just assume that the V1 beta 1 is V1 because it's been that state for so long, that we almost have to go from a V1 beta 1 to a V2 just because of that assumption that people made within the community.
Yeah, cool. I think this is a really good conversation. So happy that you have opinions about this.
Yeah. I mean, if we were talking 6 months, I'd probably have a different opinion. But if we really are talking, 12 months to a year, and we're hoping to get out of experimental within the next 6 months, I think it's a little bit of a different story, especially since we're probably going to would be in, let's say we went to V1 within 6 months, and then it's another 12 plus months before the other one was there, we'd probably be in a beta state for an additional number of months as we implement whatever CAPI came up with. So there'd be that beta transition anyway. So
Right. Yeah, so it sounds like what you're saying is V2 beta 1 as a breaking introduction, or say V1 beta 2 as a breaking introduction, make more sense than a V1 breaking introduction.
yeah, I would almost see us, I'd prefer to see us go V1 with what we consider V1 without having to wait for this massive refactoring for the new CAPI approach.
Cool. Yeah, I think you should bring those opinions to Cluster API if you're able to go to those, because I think this is a really good conversation. Saverio?
Yes, so I agree with having the big breaking change go to V2, and I just wanted to bring like the voice of the customers here. That there are folks like that are building products on these APIs. So if you in the next 6 months get out of experimental, and then we quickly go through the beta phase and we go to V1, then the V1 also has a different deprecation cycle. And so customers can commit better to build products on top of Cape Z. And then we can do the breaking change with V2. But if we just do the breaking change, like a very big breaking change between beta and V1, we would lose credibility for people that are consuming the API building products, because we will make the life of these people much harder. Does it make sense to you folks?
I think so. But I think that again, this is something we really want to bring into CAPI. Because we're gonna have to follow CAPI. We're not going to cut a V2 on a V1 CAPI API, for example. So please bring those concerns into Cluster API. And of course, I'll pass those along as well. So the open question I have for this proposal right now is actually about machine pools. So there's an open question on that PR that speaks to the fact that machine pools are experimental, and how much affinity do we want to keep between sort of orthogonal experimental features? Because Azure Managed Cluster is going to need machine pools because AKS requires VMSS. VMSS is an Azure specific thing, but machine pools are the Cluster API abstraction that represents VMSS for Azure. So I left it as an open question. I anticipate between now and next meeting, I'm going to voice my opinion that we don't worry about that, and that call that a separate. Like basically, I would like to advocate that we have the freedom to graduate Azure Managed Cluster out of experimental, separate from the machine pool. Go ahead, Dane.
I'd have to look to confirm, but I believe that's exactly what happened in the AWS provider as well. I believe that one already graduated to stable.
Yeah, and this partly informs the pivot in the last, the KubeCon pivot, so to speak, because it was deemed very, very difficult for AWS for Kappa to actually follow the recommendations that were in the proposal that folks from Kappa actually authored. So the best intentions were there, but in practice, it's really hard. So
yeah, understandable.
Yeah, so that precedent helps us. But again, I think it's really up to us to decide how we want to do that. It's good. It would require, that the Cluster API environment is feature flagged to include machine pools. So that's a little bit more UX friction for users. But from my point of view, what experimental means in terms of Azure Managed Cluster adoption is that we are going to break the API at any point. And what graduation from experimental means is that we will not break the API. So it's not necessarily a production worthiness guarantee, either non-production worthy or production worthy. It's not really speaking to any particular practical realities, like you're going to have a feature flag or not have a feature flag. It's really just a way of saying you can build a platform on top of this because we're not going to break this. Like all changes will be additive and backwards compatible. So that's what we don't have right now, which we want to deliver. And someone said 6 months. I would actually advocate we do this in 6 weeks if possible, but that's up to you folks and all of us to deliver on that.
I just threw out a number.
Yeah, no, for sure. Akinlolu.
Hello.
Hello.
I was wondering, would there be any concerns with if machine pool still an experimental and there's a breaking API change there? How is that possible that will affect the API guarantees once C is out of experimental?
Yes, that is actually a risk. So what that would mean is that because for Azure Managed Cluster, I would think that I don't think this is likely. Matt can speak to a little bit more of this. He's worked with this, but that is definitely a risk. And the way that we deal with that risk is we sort of guarantee that we would have a migration solution if that were the case.
Go ahead, Dane.
I mean, opinions are a dime a dozen. We all have them, but I feel like machine pools it's been around a while. It's even been in fairly heavy use by folks like ourselves, and I feel like we should be very close to a position where we can declare that API stable, at least from major breaking changes. I have been out of some of those threads for a bit, so I wouldn't be up to date on any recent proposals of major changes to those schemas. But it feels to me like that could probably graduate ahead of managed cluster to help ease that pain. But I'll leave that as just kind of a discussion point and maybe one for later.
Yeah, unfortunately, that hasn't happened, and I actually think that's not true. There's probably still another several months. Matt, I'd love for you to weigh in on your.
Yeah, well, I mean, the only thing I'm aware of is the proposal that we merged several months ago, but haven't actually made any implementation progress on, or enough progress, which is machine pool machines. And that would be having a machine represent each instance in a machine pool, whereas right now a machine pool is kind of a black box and all you can see is essentially the instance count. The proposal got merged. It's still viable. It's mostly just the implementation is lagging, and that would be a very large breaking change. So I think at this point we're considering that has to land in CAPI and a couple providers before machine pools is really stable. I don't know of other major outstanding and any other hindrances to machine pools being considered stable, but there probably are some, not as large. I would
Well,
guess.
to be clear, that's not breaking for Azure Managed Cluster. The machine pool, the introduction of machine pool machines would not be breaking.
We shouldn't. It might be. We shouldn't get too far into it. We're thinking anyway. Yeah.
Well,
If we
should
continue to
clarify
reuse
that.
Azure machine pool machines as we have now, it doesn't necessarily have to be breaking. Yes. Dane, you're still.
That's pretty much what I was going to say. Is what I'm interested in is stabilizing the spec of the Azure machine pool and Azure managed machine pool objects, and then the equivalent over in AWS, which seem to have stayed relatively stable throughout that proposal, at least last I checked. My knowledge is a bit dated by a few months. So and if there were to be any, it'd be nice to front load those, because then it would actually be easier to add those, because those resources, those Azure machine managed machines or whatever they call it, the machine pool machines and things like that, would just appear when you upgrade, and you'd have more functionality, but nothing should re-provision.
That's my understanding of how it would go, but it sounds like Matt disagrees with that. Like, I'm looking at an
Well, no,
AKS template right now, and there's just a machine pool spec, and I don't think the machine pool machine proposal modifies the machine pool spec.
No.
Is that right?
No, you're right. I guess we could think. Yeah, it's not necessarily blocking it in those terms, because it's introducing a couple optional new fields on the provider machine that we hunt for, and if they're there, then new behavior. And there's a new code path essentially. If they're not there, it should be backward compatible. So perhaps it's not strictly speaking blocking it. I think in a lot of people's minds, and obviously kind of in mine, this was something we wanted to see before we considered machine pools to be complete. But it may not strictly be blocking in terms of API, and maybe that's the better way to go, is just get it done, and then version 1.1 or version 2 of machine pools supports this.
Cool. Well, I definitely think we should bring this up in CAPI in the near term, but I support the idea of landing this fully before we graduate machine pools. I just want to clarify that as far as I can tell, it's what Dane said, that what's going to happen when you land on a CAPI, when you upgrade your CAPI version to include a version that includes machine pool machines, is you will now have more granularity will suddenly materialize in your CAPI surface area. But your machine pool and your Azure managed machine pool front door specifications won't change. Those are going to be identical.
Yeah, but some of your tests will probably break because maybe you weren't expecting to find new objects or something.
Fair. No, yeah, it's definitely different.
Yeah. Do we want to say any more about Azure Managed Cluster graduation? We're just encouraging people to weigh in on this PR. And
that's right. Just feel free to please weigh in on the active conversation, and I'll give another round. This coming week, I'll do some mutations to the language. So just FYI.
All right. Is there any more comments or questions on that or machine pools? Do we have anything else that's not strictly on the list here that people want to talk about? Any last minute stuff? Otherwise, I guess we can call it a day. Chris?
Hey guys, I'm not even sure if this is an appropriate question, but you guys can give me some guidance. The network policy setting in CAPI CAP-Z, is that a required field to either set that to Azure or Calico, or can it be omitted and therefore the Azure or the NPM is excluded from the cluster?
Is this a question for AKS, for like Azure Managed Cluster?
It is specifically for AKS. Yes, sorry.
I don't believe that's required. I'll actually just go ahead and refer to the type specification. So,
and I was looking there, and I feel like I'm too much of a newbie to authoritatively say that I'm looking in the right spot and interpreting that right. So.
Yeah. So the current type spec is that the values Azure and Calico are the only allowed values, and it's an optional field. So there has been, this is something for folks to think about. There has been some discussion in the past about whether or not CAP-Z should be opinionated about this, or if it should defer to AKS for its opinion. So for example, if the user doesn't specify a default, do we as CAP-Z apply our own opinionated default so that we have a notion of like a sort of CAP-Z blessed configuration? Or do we simply pass that lack of user opinion onto AKS and allow AKS to do what it wants? Generally, I would say, I don't want to say in 100% of cases, but most cases, we are doing the latter. So we're simply transparently passing that lack of configuration opinion onto the AKS API. So you can imagine there are some potential downsides to doing that, because the AKS API could change, in which case you have from T1 to time T2, you've got a CAP-Z spec that behaves differently at T1 compared to T2, because between T1 and T2, the downstream API has changed what it wants default network policy to be. And that might be undesirable for CAP-Z. So that's something that we should just be keeping our eyes on. I don't think there's a silver bullet to answering this for all cases. So it's probably a case by case basis. Anyway, that was maybe more of a digression than you asked for, but
Yeah, I may circle up with you on the Slack channel and drill into this a little bit more. The problem is that the way it's running now for this one particular customer is they feel like according to them, they're forced to pick one or the other. And then they're using these large clusters. And because, we say that NPM should be used on 500 nodes plus on AKS, they're creating a lot of overhead, API overhead doing so. So either they're misinterpreting that field or maybe there's something buggy in there somewhere, but I'll take that offline.
Yeah, cool. And again, this is a customer using CapZ for AKS.
Correct. Yes.
Right. Yeah.
I
It's
think
certainly not
that customer that.
I don't know, but in any event, the network policy field is definitely not required from CapZ's
Okay.
perspective.
Okay, I'll circle back with them and make sure that they've actually tried that properly. Okay,
Cool.
thank you.
Nawaz, of course. Thanks for bringing that up. Nawaz, I think you were next. You're muted, Nawaz. Actually, you're not muted, but you're not audible. Is anyone else hearing Nawaz?
No. Oh no, it happened again.
Sorry, I muted myself. Saverio, go ahead. We'll come back to you, Nawaz.
Yeah, go ahead, Saverio.
Yeah, I wanted to follow up on the example of the network policy. I would say that I would be strongly against doing an opinionated choose. So selecting something different from the AKS default, especially because looking at the example of the network policy, that's an immutable field, meaning that if you want to change that, you have to recreate completely the cluster. So say that in the future, for whatever reason, now there are these two options. This is just an example, like Azure and Calico. Let's say that AKS decides to drop one, and we are unfortunate that was our default. That will force all our users to recreate all the clusters. So it's a very dangerous strategy to do opinionated defaults. If it's not specified, we should always fall back to the AKS default behavior. Also, there is another point that I wanted to add, that I'm looking into the CRDs to create the managed clusters, and the implementation is not complete. So there are many options that are not implemented. I was looking, for example, at creating the outbound policy for the network. You cannot specify the user-defined routing. So what does it mean? That when you have an API that is implemented partially, all the stuff that is not implemented will necessarily get the AKS default. So on the stuff that you implemented, you cannot take your opinionated default, because otherwise it's a mixture. You can get opinionated default only once you implement the full API spec, in my opinion. Otherwise, you never know, like, what's going to happen to this parameter. It's not implemented, so it's the AKS default, or I don't specify and it's the CapZ default. It's going to be very difficult for customers and for supportability. So this is my idea. I hope this was relevant to the discussion. Thank you.
That's great. Good.
Yeah, I think that's generally true. There will be exceptions to that. But yes, that. I think everybody agrees with that. Nawaz, are you?
Probably. Can you hear me?
There you go. Yep,
Hey.
you're there.
Oh.
Hey, Nawaz.
Hey. Sorry, Chris, earlier I didn't see your hand up. I was trying to find my own hand. I just wanted to say that our meeting has fallen off the Kubernetes.io shared calendar.
I just noticed that this morning. I put an issue in GitHub because I can't figure out why.
Oh.
If anyone knows how that works, thank you for noticing that. It's a.
Yeah, Dane pointed it out in Slack. Yeah, even I noticed.
Oh, okay. We all noticed about the same time. I put it.
That.
You make a little PR in Kubernetes community, and it's got a little structure to it in YAML, and then you run a script over it, and it splats out some other markdown files, and you check in that PR. As far as I can tell, that's the whole mechanism, but it didn't seem to work. So there is a Slack channel that's specific for this, but I've not been able to get anybody to answer me on other questions. So I'll go ask there, but I'm not optimistic. We need some tribal knowledge about how this is actually supposed to work.
I thought I'd just get it to our notice in the meeting.
Yeah, good call. Thank you.
Well, thanks folks for noticing. I definitely did not notice. So I'm glad I can lean on you folks for that. Got a couple more minutes if anybody wants to share any parting remarks.
No? All right. Let's call it good for today. Thanks everybody for all the discussion and questions. I think that was a great meeting. And we'll see you next Thursday.
Thanks for
Toodles.
hosting, Matt.
Thank
Betcha.
you.
See y'all later.
Thank you.
Yep, thank you.